How's it going, everybody? Welcome back for another interview session on Locally Sourced. My name is Carter. I'm your host. Housekeeping out of the way, if you enjoy the content on this channel, please consider subscribing on the YouTube, or if you want to financially support this program, you can go to patreon.com/@locallysourced, where you can make a monthly contribution that helps fund this so that more content can be produced. We can go do actual on-the-ground reporting, book more interviews, do more analysis, stuff like that. That out of the way. Today, I actually have two guests. We have a former executive counselor and attorney, Andru Volinsky, and a former Public Utilities Commission member and attorney, Clif. And today we are going to be talking about the 3-3 tax affordability plan. So guys, welcome to the show, and it is a delight to have you. I apologize if I got those introductions a little scuffed.
Yeah, just want to clarify, I'm not an attorney.
Oh, you're not an attorney? Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry.
I was a lawmaker for 12 years.
Lawmaker for 12 years.
Former senator.
Right. Former senator. All right. So that was missing from Ballotopedia. I'm surprised. Usually they're right on track, but at any rate, so we're here to talk today broadly about the proposal that you guys put out, the 3-3 tax affordability plan. But before we get too deep into the sort of intricacies of that, of which there are many, I wanted to sort of have you guys sort of set the stage a little bit, because I think there's a lot of dissociation from the history regarding why New Hampshire is so staunchly anti-income and, to a lesser degree, sales tax, and why we put so much emphasis on the property tax. So whichever of the two of you would prefer to start out, I'm open to letting you guys have the floor on that.
Go ahead, Andy.
So I come to this as a lawyer who's litigated school funding cases since the beginning of the 1990s. I was the lead counsel in the Claremont school funding case. At the time, we sued the state over how New Hampshire funds its schools. The state contribution was about 6% of the cost of educating K-12. Well, back then they didn't even have kindergarten, so it was 1 to 12. And to get to your question of why we do things this way, the school funding system was set up as a result of something called the Pledge, which is a political promise originated by William Loeb, of the Manchester Union leader, and Governor Meldrum Thompson, 1973 governor, to basically never have an honest conversation about taxes and revenues. And the Pledge is a promise never to adopt a broad-based tax, which generally means a broad income tax or a broad sales tax. Used to mean a broad property tax as well, but that's sort of fallen by the wayside. But when you don't have those revenue sources, you wind up pushing all of the need to pay for things that are important in our state onto the local property tax. And in that regard, New Hampshire is the most reliant on local property taxes to fund public schools. And because of that, we had a 90% locally funded property tax-based school funding system, which is really good if you live in a town where the property is very valuable and your tax rates are very low. But that's not most of the state. And if you don't live in one of those few towns with that advantage, then you're paying very high property taxes and often not raising enough money for schools. And so that's what became the background of our school funding litigation. We're the fourth effort to sue the state over that kind of a problem, and we were the first successful one. So that happened in the early to mid 90s, and the court struck down how we funded our schools as unconstitutional under the state constitution, which threw it over to the legislature to design a constitutional system. And my friend Clif was in the legislature at the time, first as a state representative and then as a state senator. So this is a perfect segue to you, Clif, to talk about the problem we handed you when in December of 97, the court said this system doesn't work.
Right. So interestingly, I first ran for the State House for state representative from Lebanon in 1992, the year that Arnie Arneson was the Democratic nominee for governor. And in response to the first Claremont decision, she had generally suggested, why don't we shift our primary way of funding education from the property tax to an income tax that is more proportionate to people's income because of the regressive nature of the property tax. And I ran for in support of her running for governor. She lost. And so I said, what's my other interest? And it was energy. So I spent like 6 years in the House and time in the Senate and subsequently focused on energy policy. But when Claremont 2 was decided in December of 97, I was I was in my last year in the State House because I ran for Senate after that. But I decided to sponsor an income tax. And I was aware of an organization called the Institute for Taxation and Economic Policy that modeled state and local tax systems and had data in a publication called Who Pays that shows the regressive nature of our tax system and how some other states are able to be more proportional. As I got into reading the court's decision, I remember, the internet was not such a big thing and it wasn't easy to access historic cases. And so I asked legislative services for copies of all the cases cited in the Claremont 2 decision, which was the sort of key one that said the property tax to fund public education to a basic adequate level is in its nature a state obligation, which was understood at the beginning of our Constitution and legislature. And because of that, the taxes to support it have to be proportional and reasonable, which is a constitutional requirement, which means you can't have some communities paying 10 or 15 times as much per dollar of value for the same dollar raised to fund a student in public education. And I was acutely aware of this unfairness because at that time, my mother-in-law was a Claremont resident, had been for all of her life, and was living in the family home. And she had retired. She had been the head nurse in the emergency room at the hospital in Claremont, and she was paying 22%, 20 to 22% of her income every year in property taxes. And that was mainly by withdrawing money from her IRA. And, and the very wealthy and well-to-do communities were paying pennies on those same dollars. So that's sort of how it started. And I joined forces with another state representative, Liz Hager, a Republican. And we jointly sponsored the Hager-Below plan. Things didn't really happen that first year. And then there was an election. And I decided to run for the Senate. And of course, the party establishment said, oh, you've got to downplay your support for the income tax. I said, I can't do that. The Republicans are going to make it the main focus of their campaign and attack me on it. So I've got to explain it to people. So, I raised the necessary funds. And what I did was a mailing to people that explained the whole sort of case and used some graphics to explain how unfair the current property tax was. Some communities paying way up here and others way down low. And the region, that Senate district had both property wealthy and property poor communities, including well, not Claremont. Claremont eventually became part of the district. But in any case, what was interesting is that also caught the attention of Mark Fernald, who is an attorney who decided to run for the Senate as well. And he made this, what became the Hager-Below-Fernald plan, the centerpiece of his campaign. And both he and I won flip Republican seats that had never elected a Democrat before in over 100-year history when they kept track of such things. And we helped create the first Democratic majority in the state Senate since the 1930s. So we pressed forward and miraculously, but not so miraculously because we spent time explaining it and refining the plan. But what happened is, of course, the committee with a Republican majority in the House voted the bill to kill it, but it was overturned and passed with 51 Republican votes. And then the Senate passed it 15-9 with 4 Republican votes. So things were not so polarized back then, and something that made sense to reasonable Republicans, they ended up voting for it, and it couldn't have become passed without it. So it passed both the House and Senate. Jean Shaheen was the Democratic governor. She had run and taken the pledge, no broad-based tax, no sales, no income tax. And so she said she'd veto it if it got to her desk. And we had to amend it in the Senate to actually make it work because the bill as passed by the House was just as introduced. And we realized there were some refinements that necessary. House did not concur. And so began another 25 years of sort of floundering and more cost shifting of the state and local tax burden onto the local property tax, sometimes in the guise of a statewide property tax, but one that is not really administered in a way that's truly proportionate and reasonable.
Can I expand on one piece of Clif's story?
Please, yeah.
Which was very historic and courageous. I was there watching as the House non-concurred. That means voted not to pass the Hager-Below-Fernald income tax
to the governor.
And there was a vote. The speaker at the time was Donna Sitek, and she stalled the vote. And the reason she stalled the vote was that Governor Shaheen was waiting there in the anteroom with her 2 lieutenants, Judy Reardon and Ray Buckley, who was a representative then. He's the chair of the Democratic Party now. And the 3 of them pulled reps off the floor while the vote was stalled and browbeat them into voting against the income tax. So it had passed the House once, passed the Senate, came back to the House for this concurrence vote, and the governor personally was on the floor killing the income tax vote. That's how we got to this 25-year period of what I call purgatory.
Right.
And no suitable funding plan.
Yeah, and I mean, I've heard a story, and since you guys were there, I'm sure you can attest to whether this is true or not. But I had heard that there was a specific thing that somebody had said along the lines of, "We don't want to embarrass our governor." Now, I don't know how true of a statement but I did hear that had been said on in I believe it was the Senate.
It's entirely possible. The Senate keeps more or less verbatim record of what's said on the Senate floor during sessions. So that could be researched. I mean, it sounds very much like something that some people were saying at that time, because the governor had taken the pledge and she was going to have to veto it. But that was against, not every Democrat voted for it in either the House or Senate, but the vast, vast majority did. And a lot of people were pissed, including, curiously, a lot of people in the property-rich communities, because they didn't like the idea of the statewide property tax because it was going to increase their property tax burden. So a community like Claremont's would go down and they'd be more proportionate. And so curiously, it was some of the property wealthy communities, and not just towns like Hanover or Portsmouth, but also places like New London that had been traditionally fairly Republican, but warmed up quite a bit to the income tax as an alternative to having a significant, substantial statewide property tax.
And you had well-known Republicans supporting you.
Yeah,
Alf Jacobson was New London.
Yeah,
right.
Outspoken too. Yes,
outspoken in support. Ned Gordon was from the Lakes region, a senator by then.
Yeah, he didn't actually end up voting for that version, but Fred King did, who's North Country.
Yep.
And Leo Frazier. Yeah.
So it was support from all corners, and quite frankly, mostly because the plan made good sense.
Yeah.
Sure.
And it made the burden of funding schools a lot more fair. It didn't equalize it, but it went a long way to making it more fair. And I wrote about it in my book, which is called The Last Bake Sale. And so moving us forward, my book came out April of 25. And I went on the road and did a number of talks about the book and about the history of school funding in New Hampshire and nationally. And lo and behold, about this time a year ago, I did a talk in Enfield. And I'll tell you, it's a little intimidating to have one of the subjects about which you wrote sitting in the front row raising his hand. And there was my pal, Clif. And so after that talk, he and I spoke further and said, why aren't we introducing this again? And so that led to the formation of the Monday Afternoon Group, which is a group of various numbers, generally around a dozen. And we met basically every Monday afternoon from last June, working with the same group that Clif knew, ITEP, the Institute for Tax and Economic Policy, to design an up-to-date version of a plan that involves an income tax and a statewide property tax. And Clif, better than I, can explain why we have both. But it's a way of reintroducing fairness to the discussion of how we fund schools.
And showing what it could do.
Where we are. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I really appreciate the history here. There's only one thing that I want to sort of like maybe scratch out a little bit more in terms of the history, right? Because so far as this conversation goes at the moment, we're talking about sort of the inception point in the 70s with Bill Loeb and with Mel Thompson. But to my understanding, there's significant groundwork that sort of predates them being able to take that position. There's a bit of legal framework that exists that sort of created a notion of what was an appropriate way to tax, that New Hampshire made this very specific distinction that you don't tax people, you tax objects, you tax the things that produce as opposed to the individuals.
That's not really the history. The property tax started out as a tax on income. To be very clear, and I think it's worth actually for people to hear what the tax law was. A comprehensive tax law that was in effect at the time our state constitution was adopted in 1784. And what it said is, it's necessary that there should be an equitable rule established by law for making rates and taxes so that every person may be compelled to pay in proportion to his income. That was the introductory sentence of the tax law. And then when it went on to explain different rates for adults based with a premium on faculty or their income producing ability. I had to look that up when I saw the word tax based on faculty, plus rates on animals based on the income that they could produce, and in particular, agricultural land based on what it produced in terms of barrels of cider or tons of hay, and all mills, wharfs, ferries, houses, warehouses, and other buildings at 1/12th part of their net yearly income. Houses that didn't produce income were not taxed. And so it was a tax based on the income, what real estate could produce for income or property more generally. And that actually did evolve into a tax on machinery and inventories, which were deemed to be indicative of income producing. And so this myth that there's something ingrained constitutionally in terms of an aversion to income tax is just the opposite. If anything, it's like they were thinking people should be paid in proportion to the benefits they receive from having the rule of law and a public education system that produces and educate a population that can be productive and drive the economy. And that was all written in to Part 2, Article 83 of the Constitution. When they said right at the outset, knowledge and learning generally diffuse through a community, being essential to the preservation of a free government, and spreading the advantages and opportunities of education through the various parts of the country. They wanted to cover everyone, being highly conducive to promote this end. It shall be the duty of the legislators and magistrates, meaning people like the governor, in all future periods of government to cherish the interest of literature and sciences in all public schools. And the question, the people who didn't like the decision said, well, cherish doesn't really mean you have to support it. But then when you look at what the governor and the legislature said very early on, within a few years of adopting our Constitution, they recognized that it was, the governor said in 1795, within a decade of adopting our Constitution, that being considered by the Constitution as one of the most important duties of legislatures, we always have to provide the care and attention to it. And the legislature replied, the House and Senate said, we feel on our part the strongest obligation to revere, to cherish, and to support it. And then by the early 1800s, in 1829, the Supreme Court of the state found that taxes to pay for education are in their nature state taxes and should fall on due proportion on everyone in the state. So it was sort of a matter of convenience that property and then real estate, more limited than property wealth in general, became the proxy for ability to pay or somebody's income or wealth. And of course, the wealth is, sort of reflective of the prosperity that is a result of this new system of a self-governing population.
Sure. Yeah, and so I guess from that perspective, it's like just to maybe try and boil it a little bit. The idea is that you're talking about a period of time where New Hampshire was a significantly more agrarian society. And therefore, during that period of time, it made a lot more sense to tax based off of assets like land or livestock or whatever, because that was what was driving the production of value. And that there was sort of an association with directly taxing income that would be punitive towards sort of the lower end of the economic system in terms of like the workers that exist, and that would be more like taxing people.
It wasn't administratively practical. I mean, income tax in the modern sense, it's like they were ahead of their time. It wasn't a practical thing to administer until there was a federal income tax.
Right. And it also sort of the pitfall that it runs into, though, is that as the economic conditions through industrialization occur into this sort of technological revolution that we have now, where a significant portion of wealth that's generated by people and then captured by capital owners, it essentially gets you further away from a space where a property tax was significantly more equitable in terms of its ability to appropriately tax different brackets. So the idea is that to maintain the spirit of the original framing that they had, you would want to change the type of taxation that they're using from what in the contemporary setting is a very regressive system, right? The property tax is regressive because it's not scaling to what you're able to pay, essentially, and that we would want to follow the original intent of the people that drafted this. We would want to adopt something more akin to an income tax within the current economic scheme.
Yeah, I think so.
I think that's fair. And the clause was written by John Adams, so we know who wrote it. And it was written for the Massachusetts Constitution. And then New Hampshire, which was part of the Mass Bay colonies, broke away and copied what John Adams had written. So neither of us, by the way, is a contemporary of John Adams.
Right.
We've studied the history. One point we did in the litigation is we hired a linguist to tell us what the word cherish meant at the time this was written. And the key to it is cherish meant to nurture. So what Adams was telling the legislature and the governors at the time was that your duty is to nurture and to support and to build up education because it was foundational to maintaining a democracy. And so we've lost track of that because we have people in the legislature who are trying to starve public education of needed funds, not understanding that the broader you spread education, the more people can participate in the democracy and participate effectively. So they're in some ways undermining the ideal of a well-educated populace supporting education. And so a lot of the Claremont litigation dealt with that.
Great. This is awesome because as far as I'm concerned, it's like I always try to tell people on this program that there's nothing that exists in a vacuum, right? And history didn't start in the 1970s. Everything is cumulative. So all of these developments are relevant to where we are right now. And there's a lot of sort of persistent beliefs and positions that exist throughout the thread of time in the state of New Hampshire that change with the climate, but ultimately sort of remain the same in terms of the spirit. So I think it's good to cover all of these things. So let's bring this up to the present. You guys have basically said more or less that this is sort of the heritage of the Hager-Below-Fernald bill. And so we're trying to basically take that concept that had a bipartisan support, obviously at a time where there was significantly less political polarization between the two parties, and to try and make it more palatable in the present moment. But that means getting the Democratic Party to come on board, and potentially you might be able to get some votes out of the Republicans in the state house. But that seems like a pretty tough pull at the moment because we're now in a situation where the Free State project is in a much more advanced stage of their development, is particularly related to contributions made by the New Hampshire Liberty Alliance, which basically provides very clean directives on exactly how they should vote. and they have boiled their language and rhetoric down to basically just no new taxes ever, period, taxing bad, we don't do this. And they seem to miss the idea that you could change the scheme in a way that would include something like an income tax, and it would actually reduce their taxes on an individual level, but disperse things in a much more equitable way. So there's sort of a contradiction there. And so I guess my question for you guys, given that context, is what's the strategy on the sort of like within the Concord bubble? Right, because we're sort of there's the aspect of this has to appeal to legislators, right? They have to be able to make it marketable within the context of the state house, and then there's the separate angle of being able to get the opinion of the public, which is very outside of that bubble and oftentimes has very little interaction or understanding of what's happening within that bubble. So there's sort of two tracks that need to be adhered to. The connective point would be the ability of local public members to reach out to their representative or their senator and say, hey, please support this because it would benefit me personally, right? Sort of a selfish driver. But if you have enough people that have popular buy-in to that, then that would essentially or theoretically persuade legislators to be more open to advocating for it. So I guess I'm just sort of understanding from you guys what your view on that overall strategy is and how it differentiates between different audiences.
Well, I'd say at one level, we're not really trying to run a campaign to adopt this at the moment. We're running a campaign to educate people on the possibility and hopefully get more candidates who will run and say, this is something we should be considering. We're trying to get people to be more comfortable with just starting to have a conversation about it and take a look at how this can actually work and what the result might be. I mean, I just realistically, I don't think this is going to happen in the next 2 years, but could it happen in 3 or 4 years? I think so. And it needs some candidates, and probably a candidate for governor who's willing to stand up and say, it's time that the millionaire and billionaire class, and we have some in New Hampshire, pay their fair share, pay proportionate, and that we need to, dramatically reduce our over-reliance on the property tax if we're going to address, basic affordability issues for the vast majority of the people. And that's the point. This plan can reduce the overall state and local tax burden for the bottom 60% and only increase it in the top 20%. And that, it's important to note that the top 20% have more total income than the bottom 80%, but they don't pay anywhere near as large a portion of their income in state and local taxes as the bottom 80%. That's the basic, inequity that this supposedly being anti-tax thing covers up. It's just really, mostly benefits the top 5% and to some extent the top 10 or 20%.
Sure, and you've actually
with Clif.
Yeah, you guys actually have this this graphic that I think kind of covers a lot of what Clif was just discussing.
Yeah, let me explain that. This is a standard sort of form of tax burden analysis. Tax burden, amongst all the sort of tax experts, are is considered the taxes as a percent of income, some determination income. This is based on associated adjusted gross income on federal income tax returns. This is modeled by this Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy. And what they have is what's called a microsimulation model, which is a state-of-the-art model that the U.S. Treasury and the Congress uses for their tax policy modeling. And it's called microsimulation because they have a whole bunch of records that are actually from IRS that are sampled and blurred, so it doesn't represent anyone's actual tax return, but it's a representative sample of all tax returns. And so I don't know what the number is, but say they've got 10,000 of those that represent hundreds of thousands of returns. They can model different tax policy and see how it actually plays out. And this is the most accurate way to understand both the revenue that you would produce and where the tax burden is. So this graph divides up the population into quintiles or 1/5. So the first 4 bars from the left are each 20% of the income. And there's a table at the bottom that shows what that income range is and what the average is and so forth, and what percentage of total income is in that quintile. When you get past, so you have sort of low income, lower middle class, upper middle class, and then the top 20% is divided into 3 groups. The next 15%, the next 4%, and then the top 1%. So the top 1% is the furthest one over on the right. And what you can see is the top 1% is paying about 2.6% of their income in state and local taxes. Well, the bottom 20% are paying almost 9% of their income in state and local taxes, more than 3 times as much. They have more income than the bottom 80%, and the top 5% have more income, total income, than the bottom 60%. And in the next slide, we'll actually see how the tax burden shifts. But just to point out, red is sort of all of the excise taxes and little sales taxes like rooms and meals or what you pay in your car registration. The green at the top is income tax, and you say, well, we don't have one. That's true. This is modeled with assuming the interest and dividends tax is gone, but it actually distributes a portion of the business profits tax, how it flows through to each population group to account for business taxes as well. So we do have an income tax on businesses. It's called the business profits tax. So that's how that sort of analysis occurs. And if you go to the next slide.
Well, say what the light blue is, Clif.
Oh, the light blue is the property tax. Yeah, and that's where you can see the property tax is just a huge share, particularly in the middle class, as well as low income. And it really goes down when you get, going to the top 5 or 1%. So, in this next one, that's the upper right is the same graph that we just looked at. The bottom right is what this tax plan would do, and we'll explain how it do that. But if you just look at that, it's not perfectly proportional, but at least now the bottom 20% aren't paying any more than the fourth 20%. They're at the same level as the fourth 20%. A little bit of dip for the middle class or lower middle class, but the top 20% comes up. And mostly the top 1%. And that's what the graph on the left sort of shows. It shows the decrease on the bottom 60%. The upper middle class stays about the same. And the top 20%, particularly the top 1% and 2%, where so much income and wealth is concentrated and getting more concentrated every year. That's how we even this out. And it's just really asking high income households to pay something like the rest of us pay in terms of overall state local taxes. So that's
right. You're trying to. Go ahead.
I was going to say, you can see in the bottom graph, the green represents income tax, and it has a larger percentage of the tax burden on the right-hand side. So the wealthiest pay more of an income tax than the poorest, which is the left side. So the left side, again, still pays a lot of property tax, but because they don't earn much income, there's not much of an income tax, if any, there. But as you move to the right and incomes overall go up, wealth overall goes up, the income tax burden starts to increase from, I'd say, the middle class through the highest earning folks in our state. And when you do that, now you've evened out. You haven't made it proportional, but you've evened out to some extent the overall tax burden, so that the wealthiest people are now paying something close to a similar proportion as the working class folks in New Hampshire.
Right. And I think it's probably important to just sort of like just to add to that a little bit, or to provide a little bit of color to it, is that to implement the income tax within the 3-3 plan as it exists currently is functionally a wealth tax, which is something that gets advocated for significantly on a national scale right now, oftentimes coming from the more progressive left in terms of what people would like to see happen at a time in our society where we're seeing wealth inequality that's worse than the pre-French Revolution or the Gilded Age, right? So we're talking about like just very, very disparate economic gap between the lowest earning and the highest earning. And so this type of broad-based tax adjustment, especially with the provision that you guys have in there, where it's not touching single earners below 35,000. It's not touching families below 99,000.
But to put this in context, there are people in New Hampshire, Democrats and Republicans, whose heads are exploding because we're forcing this discussion to happen. As a matter of fact, I've gotten death threats because we've proposed an income tax. When I talk to my friends in the Bernie Sanders circle, they say this is a very modest proposal. You probably don't even go far enough in this plan to meet the Bernie Sanders, Ro Khanna kind of standard. But here in New Hampshire, a 3% flat rate state income tax dedicated for education upsets everyone's apple cart. And, one of the things we're just trying to do in releasing the plan and talking about it in venues like your show is to show people that this is a fairly modest approach to a very long-standing and economically extreme problem.
Right. And I think actually, to that point, I do actually see, for what I pay attention to, I do see a significant amount of criticism of this plan from the leftmost flank that says precisely that this doesn't go far enough. I think what's interesting about that is that this particular graph that we're looking at right now doesn't include what things would look like if we, say, reinstituted the interest and dividends tax or the estate tax, right? We're sort of setting some of those numbers aside for right now. Is that an incorrect read, or do I have that right?
Well, the interest and dividends is encompassed within the income tax. And
sure.
So all the interest and dividends would get taxed after the standard exemptions. So, retirees who are have some significant interest and dividends, by and large, would not really be affected by this plan unless they're up there in that top 20%. But that is where a lot of the interest in, the reality is most of the interest and dividends was paid by the top 5%. And that's the two columns on the right. That's not just all income. That's also interest and dividends income. And of course, the legislature, the Republican majority just got rid of that, which is mystifying because it doesn't help 95. It hurts most New Hampshire residents because it's that much more that has to be raised with the inequitable
property tax.
Yeah. But it's important to note. There are constitutional parameters, and in some sense, it would just be a huge leap forward just to follow those, which is proportionate across all income groups. We're very close to that, but it does say. The law. Some people might say, "Well, why aren't the bottom 60% paying more?" Because there's very little green on the first three columns, and that is because the standard is proportional and reasonable. The courts said proportional means a single rate, but they've also said you can have reasonable standard exemptions, both for administrative purposes, because it's too small to bother with, or in the case of a home or potentially an income tax, you could exempt for everyone a basic amount for a home. So you could completely exempt all primary residences as a distinct class, or the court has opined that you could give everyone a standard exemption for a basic home. And the same thing with income. And that's what this design is based on. It's just a single 3% rate. So even at the top 1% never end up paying more than 3% because they also get the standard exemptions, but they become minuscule relative to their total income and real estate value. Because the exemption, to walk through that, the exemption, which are based on a living wage calculator that's available at MIT, that's very well documented, and it shows a basic living wage to meet a basic standard of living in New Hampshire specifically. And it's $35,000 deduction per taxpayer. So for a couple, that would be $70,000, $15,000 per dependent. So if you had 2 children and you were a couple, that's $100,000 of income that's completely exempted before you start to pay the 3%. Also, if you're a single parent and have 1 or more children, you get both your deduction, both your children, and an extra $15,000 for being a single parent at a household, which reflects the cost to meet basic needs if you're a single parent, and you have to pay the whole cost of the apartment. That is a start, and then the $3 per thousand statewide education property tax. It's important to note that the intent is both of these should be dedicated as strongly as possible to just the education trust fund. So we've reserved the statewide property tax and education income tax just to fund education. But that plan would have a $250,000 homestead exemption. So everybody in effect would get an exemption of $3 per thousand on the first $250,000 of home value. Now this day, $250,000 doesn't buy much, even in the condo market. And to build affordable housing can cost that much to build a new unit of affordable housing or more. So the idea is that $3 on $250,000 works out to a $750,000 exemption. For administrative simplicity, you would get that by filing your income tax return, and you could use it to offset that property tax. Or if your home is worth less, that could offset more income tax. Or if you rent, the same credit would be available for each rental unit. $750 credit to allow for that fact that renters pay property taxes, both the education property taxes through their rent through their landlord. So that would be a refundable credit. So even if you don't have a tax liability, you would be able to get that cash back. But you would have to file a New Hampshire income tax return to declare that you're a New Hampshire resident, which is the reason why there is a statewide property tax, so that we don't eliminate some revenue that's coming now from second homes, as well as the commercial sector. So it maintains, in some communities, in many communities, would actually lower the borough taxes, the local school taxes, and that would lower on rental property, and even sometimes waterfront property. But in the most property wealthy communities, we would see a substantial contribution that we would maintain from places like Wolfboro and Moultonboro and Newcastle, New Hampshire, where it's mostly waterfront, where there's a lot of high value second homes. So that's why there's a statewide property tax low rate. And this plan would raise about $2 billion, all of which would go, or most of which, I mean, there's a little $1 per thousand statewide property tax that's kept locally, so it doesn't redistribute anything. But with this statewide property tax, what's my point? It all of that, what it raises, and in some communities, like the most property wealthy communities, we would get more from the statewide property tax than they pay now with the $1 one. And that would cut local property taxes tremendously. And in many communities, that substantially lowers people's overall tax burden. Our tax calculator, we should explain about that. But what this tax savings calculator does, I'll just jump into that, is there's a website.
Well, before you go to the calculator, I like to use concrete examples.
Okay.
So if you work in New Hampshire, you'll pay the New Hampshire income tax if your income is above the exemption level. So I don't want to pick on him, but a guy like Mitt Romney lives in a second home in Wolfboro. It's a $10 million.
You can pick on Mitt Romney all you want on this show, Andrew. Let me just be clear.
Okay, fair enough. So Mitt Romney won't pay any income tax in New Hampshire. But because he's got a $10 million estate, and we include a statewide property tax of $3 per thousand, he'll pay in the neighborhood of $30,000 a year in education statewide property tax. So he'll contribute to the well-being of the state, as will people who own other second homes. Now, there's another aspect. There are people who live in New Hampshire who commute to other states for work. They go to Massachusetts, they go to Vermont, they go to Maine. All of those three states have their own income tax. And because those New Hampshire residents work in those states, they already pay an income tax. And it's higher than what we're talking about. So if you're one of there are 100,000 commuters, outbound commuters. If you're one of those 100,000 commuters, you get a credit for what you pay to the other state. So you won't pay any New Hampshire education income tax. Conversely, there are 65,000 folks who live in one of the neighboring states and commute into New Hampshire. So in Clif's area, a lot of those folks are living in Vermont and commuting to Dartmouth-Hitchcock. They currently do not zero contribution to taxes in New Hampshire. Because they're coming to work in New Hampshire, they'll pay the 3% income tax. So we don't tax the people who already pay. We do tax the people who are coming into our state for their jobs.
And the people who do commute out, in most cases, vast majority of cases, are going to see a significant reduction in their property tax and
Correct.
Just free up more income from them without adding to their income tax at all.
I hope those deep red sections of Rockingham County heard that.
Yeah.
And the area south of you in Peterborough, the folks who commute into Massachusetts for work won't pay the income tax, but will benefit from the reduction in property taxes.
All right, so this is the tax calculator that you guys have set up. And the URL for anybody who's watching, if you want to actually go and do this, is nhtaxsavingscalculator.com. So why don't you guys just sort of run through what we've got here and what we're looking at in terms of the utility that people can use to actually figure out if this is working for them.
And you couldn't do this back in the day of the Hager-Bilo-Fernald plan, could you?
Right.
Not as well as this. We did have some efforts to did manual things that people could put in, and we provided the data for each town.
Yep. But go ahead and explain what this is. You're better at than me.
I just want to say something about there's an engine behind this, and it does the calculations based on your basic parameters. But what it's really tied to is a very complex model, which Doug Hall really helped develop last fall. And what it does is it takes all the data that the Department of Education has on education funding formula, as well as all the related property tax data. This is all for the year 2024, which is what we modeled this tax plan on. So it's based on 2024 assessed values and equalized values and 2024 adjusted gross income. So that's just explained at the top. And then as you start to go into the calculator, you can make some basic selections. You can, we recommend you put in your town zip code, and it will, in some cases, it'll provide an ability to look up your actual property tax for the appropriate year, mainly because that's public information that is, available in a public database. And indicate whether you rent, primary residence, secondary, your assessed home value for that year, your annual household income, then your filing status. It does say work in New Hampshire, work out of state. Some people have mixed income. There's a policy for prorating, or if one person in a household works out of state and one in state, you could just model it as if it's for the one person that works in state.
Sure.
And then it'll calculate what your net, what your property taxes would go down by, and how much you might pay in the income tax, and what you get for credits, either the renter's credit or the homestead credit. And although the renter's credit is per unit, so a bunch of housemates can't all each get the credit. It would go to one person, or be apportioned. So that's basically that works. And then there's a lot more information on the website for anybody who's interested in understanding more, and provide some actions, some way to sign up to get more, to be informed as this sort of develops. Basically right now we're just responding to requests to talk about the issue and pushing out some information. Some of our group and others are doing op-eds or covering this proposal. And more broadly, a lot of people are, including the New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute, are taking a hard look at just what is happening with property taxes and what is happening with state revenues, and how does that play out over time. There is a section of this towards the end that does go through how the funds are distributed. And that, we spent a lot of time doing different iterations of both the tax policy, which involved waiting for new runs from ITEP in Washington, D.C., as well as playing with all the different parameters in terms of how you can adjust funding. And basically, we tried to substantially increase the base amount from $2,300. Oops, not that. That's not the figure. What do we spend now?
Is it 4,100 to 10,000?
10,000.
So there's the current funding system underfunds the cost of a constitutionally adequate education, and we fix that. If you scroll up a little bit, Carter, you'll see that we put in some examples. The first one happens to be Peterborough. Right there, stop. So I can't read that quite on my screen, but it gives you the example of a person or a family living in Peterborough and what happens to them under the plan. I don't know if you have a high enough resolution on your screen, Carter.
Yeah, absolutely. So just and this is good for anybody that's listening. We have several examples here, specifically Peterborough, Claremont, Keene, Nashua, and Canaan. We'll use my southwestern example here. School taxes in 2024 were $7,644. Under the 3-3 tax savings plan, school taxes would have been $5,634, with a $750 homestead exemption offsetting a $750 education income tax. Our middle income family would have saved $2,010, and the family is protected should their income fall.
And actually, you need to understand just above the graph is what that assumes. A home locally assessed at $400,000, probably higher equalized value, and $125,000 income, adjusted gross income. So that is that example. And, one of the things that's, such an issue with the property tax is compared to that top 20% of the top 5% who have a lot of their equity in stocks, compared to people who have most of their equity in their home. If you own stocks, you don't get taxed on the appreciation value until you sell the stock. It's a capital gains tax at that point. And you can put it off for most of your lifetime, if not your whole lifetime. Right. But if your home increases in value and your property taxes can keep going up year after year after year. And right now what's happening in New Hampshire's home values have been going up faster than commercial values. So the property tax burden is shifting from businesses and commercial property onto residential property. And then the problem is, if you lose your income, you get laid off, your spouse dies, or you get divorced, suddenly you can't afford your property taxes anymore. And that is, when we have such an over-reliance on the property tax, that is part of the problem that we're trying to address with a more equitable tax system.
The other part, Cliff, is that if you have a mortgage on your house, the property tax ignores it. So you could live in a house that's $400,000 assessed value and have $300,000 mortgage, and you still pay the tax on the full 400, even though in a lot of ways the bank owns 3/4 of your house.
That's true. Yeah.
And that's not the case with stocks and bonds. You don't pay anything until you sell them, but then once you sell them, you've sold everything you've owned, not your debt, right. And you're taxed only on the profit.
Yeah, the appreciation value, not.
Yeah. So it's really an ineffective, almost punishing way to tax people having so much reliance on home values.
And it's important to note that that distributional analysis that we showed is for households, and it specifically excludes senior citizens, the elderly. And the reason that is for people who are no longer, earning an income is explained on the ITAP technical analysis, why they don't include them in a household tax burden. But if we were to add senior citizens, it would show even more inequity, because senior citizens who are staying in the home they've been in are, have declining income, particularly when they lose their spouse, but their property tax burden keeps going up. And you get these wildly disproportionate things where people are selling whatever they have in savings to pay their property taxes, like my mother-in-law did for a decade, where she was spending more than 20% of her income paying property taxes, until she finally had to sell because she couldn't afford to stay there anymore. And we moved her into an apartment up here in Lebanon.
Carter, I wrote about your mother experiencing the same problem in my book.
Yeah, that is a personal anecdote. I have been hit by this issue. And that was really unfortunate, because especially because of the timing of when that happened. That sale occurred before the sort of value inflation occurred. And so the amount that she was able to get for that sale is just a fraction of what it could have been if she was able to hang on a couple more years. But it was the taxation was so punitive for that property that it was unsustainable. So it's kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of situation. And that effectively, it's like, and now, we no longer have the property asset in my family. That's gone. And for most people, I think a lot of folks in this country understand the concept that the vast majority of wealth is tied up in property. And that is really the best way to generate generational wealth through property, which is, my own personal attitude towards that is I find that incredibly reprehensible, because you're creating a commodity out of a need. People need a home. We're talking about basic requirements of life, shelter being one of them. And we've decided to completely commodify this and have it be, in fact, one of the main drivers of wealth in our society now. And this is a big component of why there's such a sort of leftward tilt to a lot of the Democratic constituency, even in places that are purple leaning red, like New Hampshire. I think there's a significant that might very well be a notable contribution to why the state decided to go with a candidate like Bernie Sanders in 2016, where they were finding that sort of a traditional Democratic setup was not working in their favor anymore, and they wanted something that was a bit more in line with a traditionally worker-oriented formulation of the Democratic Party.
Well, you'll find today that there's a major disconnect in the Democratic leadership. There's real broad condemnation of property taxes, and the Dem leadership says cut our property taxes, but there aren't a lot of solutions offered. And in part, that's why we stepped forward, because it wasn't coming from party leadership. And as you mentioned earlier, the libertarians have no interest in this kind of fairness or in funding government. And in fact, they were the source of the death threat against me. So this is when we start to get away from the we're now getting away from the vegetables portion of this conversation and towards the tasty meat and potatoes sort of salacious aspects. So and because again, like the audience that comes to this channel is definitely has a much more progressive left lean. I've got Democratic Socialists in the audience. I've got communists in the audience. So we're definitely we're on that end of the spectrum. Although I do absolutely have conservatives that will stop in and check out what's happening here, and I'm sure that they will do so because you guys are. Considering the death threat and the attention from Jeremy Kauffman, I know that you're sort of you're a bit of a polarizing figure yourself in the moment right now. But it's like I think the libertarians are sort of that's like a known evil, right? That's sort of like to a degree somewhat predictable. But I think where a lot of folks that would be supportive of this plan get very, very hung up is why there's so much dissent for this type of a plan within the Democratic establishment. And I want to be clear when I say Democratic establishment that, like, I don't want it to come across like some big boogeyman. But there is sort of a consolidation of political perspectives within the Concord bubble, led by the Democratic leadership, which attacks far more to the center. And I think if we were talking about the state of New Hampshire broadly, this is a great example of that rightward shift of Overton window. And so I'm just sort of wondering how, as I tried to touch on this a little bit earlier, but I think it's worth revisiting, the extent to which there's opposition within the Democratic Party and why there's so much buy-in. There's the history, obviously, of Jeanne Shaheen and her acceptance of the pledge. But that's really become sort of calcified for a lot of state Democrats. Even, it's like, I know that Steve Marchand, who, it's like I had worked on his campaign. He was very open to this kind of thing at one point, and now it's not entirely clear to me if he really is anymore. And I wonder about the way that Overton window shifts on the Democratic Party in the state and how that maps onto trying to bring this kind of messaging back at this particular moment. Well, starting at the end of your question, part of the reason that we are talking to regular people and voters and trying to educate voters is partly because of our deep respect for the people who actually elect our representatives, right? But part of it is the current establishment, the current leadership, is not open to having this conversation. You won't have the House leader, Democratic or Republican, the Senate leader, Democratic or Republican, on your show with Clif and me having this conversation. It just will not happen. And so the way I think you address that is by changing leadership. And the way you change leadership is you have to change who is elected. And by talking to voters, we're hoping that they'll ask candidates. You say you want to cut property taxes. How are you specifically going to do it? Andy and Clif and other people in this 3-3 tax savings group have put out a proposal. What's wrong with it? What's good about it? How would you change it? Those are the questions that need to be asked as your state rep and your state senate and your gubernatorial candidates come to your community and ask for your vote. It's not being disrespectful. It's, we all agree there's a problem. I'm going to send you to Concord. How will you go about solving it? That's what we need people to ask. And that's why we're talking to voters and less so to leaders.
Right. And I mean, for what it's worth, I mean, I tend to have a very, and people may get upset with this, but I tend to have a very utilitarian view of politicians where, like, your job is to serve the people. That is the primary function of your job. You're representing them, and you're acting on their interests. So in a certain way, not to dehumanize them, but you are a sort of vessel for your constituency. And so to me, it's sort of irrelevant what the sort of internal drama and politics of horse trading that occurs in Concord is. That's beside the point. So I'm always very confused when I hear of representatives or senators that are have a reactionary type of off-putting response to constituents that maybe would say, hey, we really want you to support this. And the argument usually comes back, well, oh, I don't know if that's viable within the context of the state house, or I'm having a hard time figuring out how I would pitch that to my peers. And it's sort of like, it doesn't really matter how hard that job is. It's what you've been tasked to do. So this is sort of a broad assertion that I'm putting out there, and I'm just sort of curious as to what the read is.
Well, I think the problem is the conventional wisdom is, an income tax specifically is the third rail of New Hampshire politics. And that has developed because candidates for governor, whether in the Republican primary, and I mention that because after our plan passed, we had a couple of Republican senators who ran for the gubernatorial nomination supporting a version of an income tax. Obviously, they didn't make it. And Democrats sometimes do get that nomination. And the ones who've not taken the pledge have generally been defeated. Jean Shaheen, the last time she ran for governor, did drop the pledge, but it was too late at that point. And so unfortunately, there's this rationalization that goes on is, I can't make a difference unless I win my election. And in order to win the election, I just need to stay away from this because I might lose too many votes and lose the election. And the Republicans will attack me for supporting an income tax. And quite honestly, the only way to combat that is to try to turn things around and explain some basic points. That the property tax is a tax on your income. It's just not in proportion to your income. You pay your property tax from your income, and even if you rent, in your rent, you're paying property taxes from your income. Unless you run out of income, then you have to use your life savings, whatever that is, whatever's left of it. So what I found when I was campaigning, something like that, something that simple, would cause someone to say, oh yeah, I hadn't thought about it that way. And, I think there's probably a greater openness in the population than there is certainly in the Democratic leadership, much less the Republican leadership. But, we can expect, hopefully, a very big shift Democratic, and hopefully there's some more progressive people who say, we should be considering something like this. And some will emerge as new leaders because they're able to articulate this in the broader context of, we have a system where the rich have been getting richer, and we've been tending to disenfranchise those who are already disadvantaged. So if you believe in equity, if you believe in the rule of law, if you believe in preserving democracy, you should be open to this plan. Because
and the first step is being open to the conversation. Yeah. We need to have the dialogue. So if your candidate for office says absolutely not without any conversation, that should be a red flag. Those candidates need to not be elected. I'll be as blunt as that.
No,
we can
I
disagree on
that.
The best way. We can disagree we can talk about different ways to do this, and Clif and I are open to that. And in putting this plan together, considered many different iterations, but to simply say we're not going to talk about anything that could help solve the over-reliance on property taxes, for me, is a non-starter.
Right.
I do have to head off soon.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I really appreciate your time, guys. I definitely, it's like certainly I could probably talk about this with you guys for quite a bit more time, but I think we sort of passed off a lot of information here. And I think that it's good for people to sort of go over this, have a look at the website, make your own decisions. But this is, from the assertions that I'm hearing from you guys, a lot of this needs to occur on a grassroots level. And I think that's probably the best position to approach it from. This is a great way to build coalition and sort of open people's eyes to the unfair tax structure that they tacitly understand if they live in this state, but maybe don't necessarily have the language or mechanisms to articulate it. So I really appreciate you guys for coming out. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, I appreciate you, Carter. Thanks for doing this. Thanks for having us.
Of course.
Be safe.
All right. Yeah, you too. Take care, guys. And that will do it for today's episode. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed this program, again, subscribe, go hit the Patreon, do that thing, and we will catch you guys for the next show. Cheers and have a good one.